Any code tips. Why write clean code? It's really easy to get confused, especially when you're first starting off programming. It's really easy to get confused because the way your code is laid up is actually not very readable, right? Like what I always use an example is like imagine reading like a book without punctuation or without like spacing, right? Like imagine if someone just like arbitrarily capitalized certain letters. There was no like periods in places, like the paragraphs weren't really spaced out. Like there's no concept like chapters or sections. Like imagine how painful that is. And yet, like I think when a lot of people start writing code, like that's kind of their initial. It's like, hey, let me just write like programming things on there. But come back to what I said a bit earlier, right? Like actually, if you think about kind of how if I could like do a pie chart of how my time is spent whenever I do a piece of programming, I would say maybe like 40% of it is spent like thinking about how I actually want to solve the problem, like how I want to approach it and how I want to do it. Maybe 25% of it is spent on actually writing the physical code, and then another 30 to 40% is trying to figure out like why does it not work. Unfortunately, and that last part is it's kind of tongue in cheek, but we do spend a lot of time testing and troubleshooting the code after we've written it. So the main point there is that less than a third of the time is actually spent like physically writing the code. It's actually a lot more important before you start writing code to kind of have a good idea of what you want to do. And the reason why that relates to clean code is because when someone looks at your code, it should be very clear based on the syntax what you're trying to do here, right? It's like if I look at someone who made a really nice list, like I can kind of tell like what their headers are, or what they're trying to get, where they're trying to get at. Same as code, right? So writing good, clean code, it's really important to make it easier for others to read your code and understand it and potentially fix it or modify it. And when I say other people, it could mean third parties. It could also mean you in the future. And you in the future is actually a really really good like test case, because imagine how frustrating it would be for you to look at something that you've written and have no idea what's going on, right? Like that's kind of what we're trying to guard against, right? Is that for you to write code that hopefully is very, very clear to whoever's reading it, even if it's you from the future, to be like, oh, like I don't remember writing this, but yeah, I can look at this and I have a good sense of I'm trying to do A, B, and C. I'm trying to do it through, X, Y, and Z. So that's why like writing clean code is super important. So I'm just going to give you two quick tips. The other reason for why you want to write clean code is because in most job interviews, like they care about how you think, they care about getting a good answer. But if you just write like really sloppy, really kind of improper code, it does give them pause, right? It's like someone going to a job interview and just having and writing, really, let's say, poorly formatted emails, right, or anything like that, or if they speak very unprofessionally. They're just kind of things that just make you stand out in a way that you don't want to be noticed for. Okay, so the two things I'll talk about, one is indentation, and the other one is naming. Indentation. So in JavaScript indentation, basically it's a very sequential affair. And what I mean is the indentation of each line is almost always based on the line kind of coming previous to it. And so the rules of thumb for indentation in JavaScript are, if I have an open curly brace, as in I'm making a new block, everything after that curly brace is going to be indented by 1 unit until I get to a point in which I'm closing the curly brace. So I have the closing curly brace. When I say 1 unit, one of the things you'll hear about is people say like, oh, do I want to use tabs or 4 spaces or anything like that? I have my own personal preferences, but quite honestly, it doesn't matter. The most important thing when you write code is that you're consistent, right? The worst thing is you use like 2 spaces here and like 3 spaces here and like a tab there, right? Like that just makes your code very, very unreadable. So as long as you're consistent, it doesn't really matter what you use. Although I would, say at least 2 spaces if you opt for four spaces, just because 1 space is sometimes a little bit imperceptible and not really easy to distinguish. So looking at the example on the page here, right, for the amazing function on line 4, notice how the amazing function on line 4, I end with a closing curly brace. So I know that everything after line 4 has to be indented by 1 unit, so to speak, until I close that curly brace. and I actually close that curly brace on line 11. And so that's why lines 5 through 10, they're all indented by at least 1 unit, right? The if statement, the comment on line 7, the console log on line 8, the closing curly brace on line 9, those are all indented by 1 unit. Now, on line 6, I have an if statement, and that if statement has its own curly brace, right? And so after that curly brace, I remember after a curly brace, I always indent the next line by 1 unit relative to the curly brace. So on line 6, because I end with an open curly brace, I actually indent lines 7 and 8 by 1 unit relative to line 6. What that also means is now I'm indenting line 7 and 8 by 2 units relative to line 4. Right? So if I look at the code now, lines 5 and 6 are indented by 1 unit because I only need to worry about line 4. Lines 7 and 8 are indented by 2 units relative to line 4 because I also need to indent 1 unit for line 4 and then 1 unit for the opening curly brace on line 6. On line 9, I close the curly brace, so line 9 is de-indented by 1 unit relative to line 8. And notice how whenever I close a curly brace, that should be at the same indentation level as the opening curly brace. So notice how lines 6 and 9 are at the same level of indentation. And then similarly, lines 4 through 11 are on the same level of indentation as well, because those are kind of the open and close of the same set of curly braces. Okay, so the reason why we do this is because now when I look at this code, if I just kind of look at it at a high level, it's very clear that because of indentation, it's clear to me at least that lines 6, 7, 8, and 9 are a part of what we call one block or one section of code, right? Because they're all indented at like a similar level, if you will, right? Lines 7 and 8 are indented by 1 unit relative to lines 6 through 9. So I know that 6, 7, 8, and 9, they're part of one capsule, one block of code. Similarly, if I look at lines 5 through 10, I can tell that because they're all indented by 1 unit relative to lines 4 through 11, that also is 1 unit of code, right? So I know that everything between lines 5 through 10 applies to things between lines 4 through 11, and then lines 7 and 8 belong to not only lines 4 through 11, but also lines 6 through 9. And so just from a very, very visual and spatial perspective, it just kind of helps me segment my code to delineate like, oh, like this belongs to this belongs to this. As you work on more and more complex functions, this becomes very important and very and it's a key marker to make your code very readable. The reason why this is hard to sometimes for people to do is just because they don't care, and the reason why they don't care is because whereas spacing and indentation is really nice for a human to know what's going on, computers don't actually care. If your code is improperly spaced, if you use like 5 tabs here and like 20 spaces here and no spaces on the next line, a computer actually won't break. It will actually execute the code perfectly well, right? So in the workshop you'll do later today, one of the things you'll notice is that the code's going to be poorly formatted, but it will still work. And the point we're trying to show you is that, hey, poorly formatted code still runs. It just is really hard for humans to read. Okay, so just as a best practice, we really want to start kind of having you build up good habits as soon as possible, and indentation is one of them. Any questions on indentation? Actually, as you ask, I'm just going to grab my charger from my bag, so I'm listening for sure. But just yeah. Any questions on indentation?
How many spaces per unit?
That's up to you. Typically, people use 4 or 2. I think those are the 2 most common ones. If you Google it, you'll find a lot of people with very, very strong opinions on something that I think is quite silly. But like I said, more than one space if you choose to use spaces, and I think the most important thing is that you're consistent. In most code editors, so either some of them have like auto indent for you, and some of the other ones actually have conversions for you too. So if you say I want to change all my tabs to 4 spaces or all my 2 spaces to tabs, those do that for you too. So it's actually like, as long as you're consistent, like the computers are actually very good at taking care of a lot of like the more manual parts of the process. Yeah. Sorry, just plugging it.
But actually, I do have a question.
Absolutely, go ahead. Sorry, here.
So, in the event that, like, let's say in line 5, we were to declare if we were to declare a variable,
Mm-hmm.
would the if statement on line 6 be indented from that variable, or would it be in the same line?
Yep. Cool. So I think maybe it was Catherine who said this. It's like in programming, the most important thing is just to do it. So you'll also see me do this a lot. Just like I'll just copy code. I use something called REPL to demonstrate code. I think it's very clean and very easy. Um, and it actually is also something I can share after I write it. So okay, cool. So to the question here, your question is if I have some. Oh, wow, did I make caps gone? If I do something like so great, so REPL indents for me automatically. What you're saying is if I have something like let x equals 6 here, right? The question is do I indent line 3 through 5?
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah. So notice how line 2 or this variable declaration, it doesn't end in a curly brace. And so if a line does not end in either an opening curly brace or a closing curly brace, it's at the same indentation as a line above it. Right? So if I have like the y equals 10 here, right? Both lines 2 and 3, these don't end in curly braces, and so these two are at the same level of indentation. I misspelled let here, right? If I have another if statement here, if I say, if, false, and I'll say, console.log out false. Lines 2 through 3 have to be indented by one level, well, because they're both inside this amazing function that we create this on line 1. But lines 2 through 3, like neither one of them end in a curly brace, either opening or closing, and so we know that they're just lines of code. And so if there's no change in scope, if there's no change in curly braces really, the lines are going to be at the same level of indentation as the line above it, right? I go to line 5. Line 3 is at the same level of indentation as line 2, and line 5 is at the same level of indentation as line 3, right? Because line 3 doesn't end in opening curly brace. The only reason why line 6 is indented by an extra unit is because the previous line ends in a curly brace, right? This shows we're creating a new scope, and line 7 is de-indented, if you will, by one line rather than the previous line because it ends in a closing curly brace. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
Yep. One last thing I'll say here is just I notice a lot of people when they do this, they do something that's like let's say let's say this is like misindented, or this is misindented. When you're first starting off, I really strongly encourage you to work your way from the top down. And the reason why is because unless you kind of get a good, more experienced feel for this, a lot of times when people are first starting off and they look at, for example, they look at lines 5 through 7, they're like, oh, clearly this is misindented. They just jump in here and they do something like this, right? And if you do something like this, if I look at just lines 5 through 7, it's technically correct, right? But when I put it in the context of the rest of the function, like you see like, wow, like everything here is actually misindented by one unit. And so you actually need to indent everything by one more space. And so this is why I'm saying like whenever you work on spacing, especially when you're first starting off, try working your way from the top down, because more often than not, spacing happens very sequentially, and the indentation of every line does depend a lot on what comes before it. And so rather trying to jump in the middle and trying to fix something in the middle, when you're first starting off, it's a really good practice to just start from the top down, so you have the proper context for why something is indented the way that it is. Cool. The last thing we're gonna talk about, and like I said, this is a very, very short section, is variable naming. So variable naming is it's something that people notice if you get wrong, because I thought, like I said, there's a lot of conventions that people have that that they expect certain things. Sorry. Okay, so usually when you make a variable, use something called camel case. What camel case means is if I have a word like let x equals whatever it is, or let David equals this thing, the first letter is the first letter of the first word is always in lowercase. What camel case says basically is that if I have a variable that's made up of multiple words, the first letter of the first word is in lowercase, but then the first letter of every subsequent word should be capitalized. So if I read it, I know exactly like what words are kind of in this variable, right? So so if I look at line 2, the variable is my favorite place equals full stack. There I can see clearly that my is the first word because I know that's everything up until the first capital I know that the second word is favorite because the F is capitalized and it comes before the P, and then the third word is place because the P is capitalized, right? And if let's say the P wasn't capitalized, right? In this word, you could probably still, in this example, you could probably still figure it out. But it could very well be my favorite place or my favorite, and then P, and then capital L place, right? If I want to change place to two separate words. So when you use camel case, it just makes it really easy for someone to read it. And that actually leads to the next point of why we do this is because, in most cases, it's best not to use ambiguous variable names. Like let x equals 68, it's fine, it works. But what we really want to caution against is you having a lot of these variables that are like, let a equals 1, let b equals 3, let c equals x, or let c equals like 26, let d equals a string. We have too many of these things randomly flowing around. It actually becomes very unwieldy, and people look at it like, I have no idea what this variable is supposed to be. And so whenever possible, we always ask that you use kind of more robust or more precise variable names, right? So on line 8, if I'm trying to capture the current temperature, let's just call it current temp, right? Notice the camel case there? Like that just, so whenever I see this variable down the road, I don't need to be like, oh, what was x again? It's like, oh, current temp. Okay, just, logically speaking, that probably means the current temperature. Okay. Obviously, there are certain exceptions. Usually, one of them is when we use a for loop, which we'll talk about this afternoon. Usually, in that case, it's fine to use like things like I or X or Y or J or K. And it's just because it's very shorthand, and people know that you're only using this variable for this loop, and so it's fine to kind of be more concise there. But in general, when you're using variables that are going to be used in multiple places, the more descriptive the naming, the better. I guess is the good rule of thumb there. Um, the reason why we don't capitalize the first letter of the first word is because when you do that, usually in programming, capitalizing the first letter of the first word means you're creating a class. We will talk about classes a lot more when we talk about arrays and functions and objects. But just know for now that a class it's something that you don't want to necessarily confuse for with a common variable. Classes are kind of almost like molds, like you use classes to make or use other pieces of code. So it means something very different. And so in JavaScript, always make sure that the first letter of the first word is lowercase. Otherwise, you're actually writing something completely different that you probably don't mean to write. Okay, and just like I think for classes, I think actually before I say I think, let's just try it out, right? If I have something like let x equals 8, this is going to run perfectly. But if I do let x equals 8, I wonder if JavaScript is going to yell at me for this. Okay, maybe not. If I do x-ray, okay, I guess JavaScript doesn't care in this case. But when you do something like this, what it does is you're signaling that you're creating a class called X-ray. If you want to just make a variable called X-ray, it should just be like lowercase X-ray, right? In fact, notice how when you capitalize X-ray, I'm not sure if you can see it on your screen, but on my side, the text turns green. And so another good thing of editors, a lot of times that happens, is like when it turns to something else. Actually, maybe it's just because of the number. Let x equals min9. Oh, no, okay, yeah. I'm sorry. Hello. Oh, sorry. I think someone's got unmuted. Okay. Um, yeah. So just when you're naming it, just be aware that like certain times, like for example, like this capital X and X-ray, this makes JavaScript things that you're talking about a class, right? Notice how they highlight it differently. In this case, it doesn't break anything, but in the future, it might. So just kind of be careful there. Um, Other than that, like if you use like A, B, C, D, just like very non-descriptive variable naming, the computer is going to work perfectly fine. If you use camel case and you miscapitalize a certain letter, the computer's going to work perfectly fine. A lot of this we're doing is meant for human consumption to make it easier for humans to read. So these are kind of best practices. A computer might not notice it, but if you're going to a job interview, like as someone who helped recruit engineers before, like we definitely notice it when people write poorly formatted code, and it's not something you want to be known for. Like it just feels like it's like either you don't care or like it's like, wow, this person just really does not have a good grasp of like core basics. Cool. So on that note, oh sorry, I should ask, are there any questions? Yeah, go ahead.
I just wanted to clarify, in regards to when you're using one single equal sign, that's more than anything kind of assigning a variable to a value, but that's not necessarily saying that it's equal to, right? It's saying that it's kind of like a cubby situation. You give kind of like the key and the value, right?
Mhm.
I think.
Yep.
And so if you wanted to say literally x is equal to 5, you'd do x equals 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 5.
Yeah, so we'll talk about operators in a later section. We'll kind of go a little bit more in depth about it. But I think the crux of it is like whenever you see a single equal sign, it is always an assignment operation. Always. It's never a comparison. Comparison in JavaScript, or in programming really, when you do a comparison, you're really getting back a binary answer, true or false, right? Like, are these things equal, yes or no? When you use an assignment operator, you're doing like a fundamentally different thing. You're saying, hey, you are this, right? There's no kind of true or false associated. It's just like you're taking a direct action. When you're comparing something, you're always getting back a true or a false. And so in JavaScript, I guess and I'm pretty sure this applies to almost all the other higher level programs. Like whenever you see a single equal sign, that almost always means you're assigning something. Yeah. So nothing on this page has to do with comparisons. Yeah.
I have a question. So when there's a nested loop, I've seen that characters such as I or J are used.
Mhm.
Are those kind of like are those the best practice characters?
So for loops, people start with I usually, and it stands for index. It's short for index. And then usually if you have two nested loops, obviously you can't use I over and over again. So you go from I, then you do J, K, L, whatever it is. So that's kind of like that's more of a rule of thumb, right? Like nothing stops you from starting at A and going to B, right? Or starting at X and going to like M. It's just I usually stands for index, so it's just like a best practice. Yep. Any other questions? Cool. All right. So that wraps up like the slide portion of it. We're gonna stop the recording now. But I'm also going to sorry. But I am also going to